Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to Global Rights for Women's Conversation Series, Valiant Voices. I'm Rhonda Martinson and will be today's moderator. Before beginning today's discussion, Global Rights for Women would like to acknowledge the Indigenous people of the lands that we're on today. We recognize that we have and continue to benefit from the theft and occupation of these lands since before the United States was even formed as a country. Global Rights for Women is in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and acknowledges being on Dakota and Anishinaabe lands. We recognize the discrimination and violence inflicted on Indigenous people around the world. We understand the treatment of Indigenous people, or Indigenous women particularly, is a byproduct of colonialism, racism, and misogyny that perpetuated continued sexual abuse, disappearance, and murder of Indigenous women. So please join us in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harm of the past and the present, and consider how you could help dismantle continued oppression of Indigenous communities and restore justice. And now, if you'd like to put into the chat that land that you're acknowledging, we'd really appreciate it. Again, thank you very much for coming. And again, my name is Rhonda Martinson. I'll be today's moderator. I'm an independent consultant in coordinating community responses to domestic violence, and I've worked recently with Global Rights for Women in that area. Global Rights for Women is an organization that works to end domestic and sexual violence around the world through systemic and legal change. Valiant Voices is a feature of human rights advocates and survivors who are addressing injustice and oppressive systems that cause harm. These are stories of leaders creating change in their communities and around the world. Valiant Voices received the 2023 National Purple Ribbon Award for Outstanding Domestic Violence Podcast. This recognition for excellence wouldn't be possible without our donors who support these conversations, or our guests who bring authenticity, experience, expertise, and passionate commitment to ending gender-based violence around the world. We welcome your comments, our participants. We welcome your comments in the chat or your questions in the Q&A section. After the conversation, we'll send out a link with the recording. And if you need a certificate of attendance, please contact Sophia Morissette at smorissette@grwomen.org. Today, we're going to be talking about guns, domestic violence, and community safety. We recognize that there may be survivors here, so parts of this conversation may be triggering. In the chat, we include resources for people in the US and internationally who might need safety and assistance. And now let's introduce our guests. First of all, Ruth Glenn, who is our current president of Survivor Justice Action and recent president and CEO of the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, an organization dedicated to holding abusers accountable while protecting survivors and advocates. Previously, she worked in the Colorado Department of Human Services for 28 years and served as the director of the Domestic Violence Program in her last 9 years there. Ruth is a survivor of domestic violence and of being shot several times by her estranged husband 31 years ago. To enlighten others about the prevalence and development of domestic violence, she has shared her story in her book, Everything I Never Dreamed: My Life Surviving and Standing Up to Domestic Violence. She's also advocated for legislation involving firearms and domestic violence. We know that this is an important cause. For the last 25 years, the Violence Policy Center has published an annual report entitled When Men Murder Women. And for the last 25 years, those reports show that most women murdered by men are murdered with a firearm. Lou Marie Orozco, director of the Firearms Technical Assistance Project at the Battered Women's Justice Project. Battered Women's Justice Project is a national legal resource center on gender-based violence. Previously, Lou Marie served as the Director of Special Initiatives at Esperanza United. She provided culturally responsive training and technical assistance on lethality and intimate partner homicide prevention. Additionally, as a community psychologist, Lou Marie has worked with local, national, and international project partners to enhance practices of community-based organizations and criminal justice systems in serving Latina survivors. Lou Marie is also a survivor of domestic violence. Kate Ranta is a survivor of domestic abuse and gun violence and now an activist. In November 2012, Kate's estranged husband, an Air Force major, appeared at her apartment and shot her twice and her father twice in front of her then 4-year-old son. Everyone survived. This man was found guilty in 2017 on all charges against him and sentenced to 60 years in prison. Kate now elevates her story for activism and awareness around violence against women, especially the deadly intersection between abuse and guns. She has been a gun violence prevention activist for many years. She is a public speaker and a marketing professional. She has appeared in documentary films, national media, and expert panels. Kate is the author of Killing Kate, a story of turning abuse and tragedy into transformation and triumph. And Joe Shannon is communications manager for Violence Free Minnesota, a statewide coalition of programs working together to end relationship abuse. Violence Free Minnesota has for 34 years published an annual report on domestic violence homicides in Minnesota. Joe has for many years played a large role in collecting and analyzing information about these homicides in preparation of these annual reports. And he recently co-authored an op-ed piece about systemic failures indicated by some of these homicides. Thank you all for joining us, panelists. And now, before I ask my first question, it would be good to set a bit of context for this discussion. Domestic violence and access to firearms are a lethal combination. Abusers with guns are 5 times more likely to kill their female victims. Threats with weapons reinforce power and control in intimate partner relationships. And the effects of firearms and domestic violence impact more than the individuals and families directly involved. Over half of the mass shootings in the past decade were perpetrated by domestic abusers, raising the stakes for our community's safety. And we saw just yet another example of that very thing in our country in Lewiston, Maine, just a few weeks ago. The Pew Research Center in the state of Washington says that 57% of teenagers now have elevated anxiety and fear to go to school. 1/3 of adults are fearful of going to events and retail stores. So domestic violence intertwined with gun violence restricts both the freedom of individuals and creates fear in communities. In addition, the U.S. Supreme Court just heard oral arguments in the U.S. versus Rahimi case to determine whether a person subject to a domestic violence protective order should have a constitutional right to keep their firearms. In this panel discussion, we're going to talk about risks to survivors, the possible impacts of this Supreme Court decision, and how the intersection of guns and domestic violence can be addressed. So Kate, my first question is for you. I'm struck by some of the parallels between the context we just set for today's discussion and your own experience. For example, in the case of the shooting in Lewiston, Maine, the perpetrator was a man with a connection to the military, and according to some news sources, also with a history of domestic violence, which is, again, a parallel to your situation. And in the case of the upcoming Supreme Court case, a man who was the respondent to a domestic violence protection order is objecting to the prohibition against possessing firearms. So I'm wondering, what are you thinking today? What would you like to say about these parallels that we see playing out in victims' lives over and over and over again across the country?
Well, my son and I just spoke on the steps of the Supreme Court 2 days ago regarding the USA versus Rahimi case. And what I kept saying was, why would we want to set a precedent where we make it easier for these men who show violent tendencies toward those that they purport to love and have vowed to protect? Why would we make it easier for them to access weapons, to carry out their violent acts? In my case, I had received a temporary restraining order against him. My case happened in Florida, and when I obtained the temporary restraining order, the police said that they could go into our home and seize the weapons that were in the home, which they did. But then in the next breath said, well, there's nothing legally stopping him from going out tomorrow and getting a new gun. So I had done the things that I was supposed to do. I just left, like we always tell women to do when they're in a abusive situation. And I took the steps to protect myself and my family by getting a restraining order, yet then was told, that he could go out and legally buy another gun. So in the Rahimi case, that would be detrimental nationwide to our laws and abusers, easier accessibility to get guns, and that's their weapon of choice. I've been asked so many times along this journey, well, he could have used a knife or a car or any other sort of weapon, but no, he chose to use a gun. And that's what these violent men are using to try to kill their families, women and children. So the parallels for me were very, very stark. And I couldn't believe that I found myself 10 years later, 11 years later, on the steps of the Supreme Court having to argue for this when I've been yelling about it for a decade about what happened to us and the deadly intersection between abusers and guns and the lethality, and that it took almost my murder for anything to be done about him and for his him not to be able to access guns. So it's been quite a week.
I'll bet. And
Yeah.
and Pat, while you're checking to see if any of our listeners have a question for Kate, I have a follow-up one that I'll ask. Kate, you've been a strong and passionate and public advocate in this area, and I'm wondering if you're seeing anything in all of your communication and contacts with people as far as successful strategies in addressing guns and domestic violence.
Well, for almost every step forward, it seems like then a step back will happen. Like we just have had with the Supreme Court case, which I couldn't even believe happened. But there have been states that have been able to tighten their gun laws. I now live in Massachusetts that has some of the strictest gun laws, or if not the strictest gun laws in the country. I think we have a long way to go. I think we make it far, far too easy for men with that prove that they are violent to be able to have access to guns. And I think that we need to do a lot more work on making sure that that doesn't happen.
Agreed.
Yeah.
And Pat, do we have any questions from our listeners? Or if not, do any of our...
not yet. I think what we want to do is go through a first round of questions and then open it up to people in the chat.
Absolutely. But Kate was so prompt and succinct, we thought we'd have a bit of extra time there. Do any of
Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Kate. Do any of our fellow panelists have a comment or question for Kate?
Just a comment. I think I would like to let everyone on the call know what a champion Kate is for this issue. And I have other thoughts about Kate, but I just want to acknowledge that she is a warrioress and really determined to help us address these issues nationwide.
Thank you, Ruth. Likewise.
That's what we need, and that's the kind of panel that we have today. So thank you for mentioning that.
No questions are off the table for me. So anything anybody
Okay.
has, I'm willing to answer anything.
Okay. Well, we'll encourage people to do that. And meanwhile, Joe, my next question is for you. I've talked to you in the past, Joe, about justice system failures that played a role in domestic violence homicides. And in your and my home state of Minnesota, gun violence is the leading cause of domestic violence homicides. So in your role analyzing this homicide information every year and preparing reports, public reports, what can you tell us about these areas of our justice systems? For example, are there any typical areas of failures? And are there any areas of system success?
Thank you for having me today. And I think I'd like to start with law enforcement response to domestic violence calls. We know that not everyone has interaction with the legal system or law enforcement, but in our each year in our homicide report, we know that around half of the individuals do have some sort of interaction with the legal system, and a lot of that does begin with law enforcement. And we believe that there needs to be better relationships built between law enforcement and domestic violence advocacy programs. And this is to initiate more referrals to domestic violence advocates when these DV calls happen, because advocates are the experts. They know how to help victim survivors access safety. They know the resources that are available. And this is really something that we'd like to stress. And we also like to stress, the warm referral aspect of it, because, just handing someone a card with a number on it is, not necessarily something that helps or is beneficial. And so we think that's a starting point. We believe that courts need a better understanding of domestic violence. In cases that are brought to court about domestic violence, we think expert witnesses should be called in to accurately describe domestic violence to judges and jurors. We know there was a high-profile case here in Minnesota where a woman was severely beaten and sexually assaulted by her ex-boyfriend, and the court did not want to enter any of the text messages exchanged that presented examples or evidence of domestic violence, because they would have to call in an expert witness. And we believe that these expert witnesses need to be called in, because domestic violence is still not fully understood by the courts, and how it affects victim survivors. We also think that a great starting point for the courts is to use the 5 risk factors that we outline in our homicide reports. And these should be used to assess the risk level of danger of whether a person will further hurt or kill their victim upon a plea deal, bail, or release. These 5 risk factors are a history of violence, if the victim was strangled, threats to kill the victim, if the victim was separated or attempting to leave, and access to firearms. We know that victim survivors need to be believed when they say their partner is going to hurt them or kill them. We analyze these 5 risk factors, and we know that when a threat to kill happens, it greatly increases the risk of homicide, and victims' stories need to be heard. As for another one of those risk factors, the access to firearms, we have recommended in our homicide reports, we include a series of policy recommendations. And for many years, we have recommended to rescind the state statute that bans the Commissioner of Health, so the Minnesota Department of Health, on collecting data on individuals regarding firearm ownership. And we know that if we don't know who owns guns and how many guns are out there, we don't even have a starting point of how to address this situation. As has been mentioned here, studies have shown that the presence of firearm increases risk of homicide 5-fold. On average, in Minnesota, around 50% of intimate partner homicide victims are killed by a firearm, and that is the overwhelming majority. It's more than double of any other method. The next highest method of killing is usually around 15 to 20%. In 2023, in Minnesota so far this year, at least 21% of homicide perpetrators have been prohibited to possess a firearm. In 2022, 1/3 of the perpetrators who killed their partner were prohibited to possess a firearm. Michael Klinger shot and killed Katie Ann Fredrickson on July 30th last year. 4 days prior to this, he shot and killed his ex-girlfriend's dog and told her, "Now you're alone forever." He was prohibited to possess a firearm, but when he was arrested, he was found with 3 stolen guns. He had at least 3 convictions for possessions of a firearm, and 1 dismissed charge for possession. The most recent of those convictions was in 2017, 5 years before he killed his partner. And so we would like to know, how did he have access to these guns? And if he had these 3 convictions, what was done to prevent him from obtaining a firearm? Where were the failures that allowed him to still have access to these guns? And that's where, we believe that we need to start with this access to firearms to prevent intimate partner homicides in the future.
Wow, that's pretty jaw-dropping, that summary of the case that you just described. Do any of our other panelists, all of you I know have experience with this intersection of domestic violence and guns. Any of our other panelists have any comments or questions for Joe? Joe,
We do have a question in the chat about
Okay.
statistics for the percent of cases where family courts were involved. Do you have any information you could share on that?
Unfortunately, we do not have any statistics on that. We gather all our information from public sources, and so that can be a bit difficult to find. And that's kind of one of the areas that we would like to see more access for us to have that information, so we can further analyze these cases and learn how to better prevent them.
And I would add to that, just really quickly, the other issue around family court systems, even outside of the relationship that they may have to our firearms violence, is that it is so jurisdictional, right? So trying to get that information from the myriad of jurisdictions who have different policies and or laws about information they do share, how they share it, when they share it, is what we have found in the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence to be so very challenging. And again, we weren't even talking about the issues of firearms. We were just talking about how can we better inform the courts, how they can get trained and all of those type of things. So I just want to add to that, that is when we are talking about a system, any system, but particularly the family court systems, and sometimes even just the confidentiality that's invoked can be very challenging.
In my situation, I feel like one court wasn't talking with the other. So when I got the temporary restraining order and with the gun issue involved, that was criminal court. But then we also had a family court situation going on, and it felt like one wasn't speaking with the other. And that was a real issue because the family court, I feel they failed completely, but they didn't fully, I believe, understand how dangerous of a man was sitting in front of them, during our divorce proceedings. So there's a disconnect there.
I think that's one of the big challenges, right? Is that there is this lack of coordination and communication between the criminal justice response system, service providers, survivors, and communities of what's actually going on So until we like bridge and figure out how that happens in a way that's meaningful, I think we're going to continue to run into these challenges.
Agreed. And Lou Marie, my next question is for you, so your timing is perfect. So we've heard now from Kate and about a little bit about her individual experience, and we've heard from Joe with his state level experience and knowledge of homicides in our home state of Minnesota. And Lou Marie, you have a combination of very unique experiences in this intersection of guns and domestic violence. So as the director of a firearms technical assistance project, as the provider of culturally responsive training on lethality and intimate partner homicide prevention, and I think this is really fascinating, as a community psychologist working to enhance system responses to Latina survivors, and finally, as a survivor yourself. I'm just kind of wrapping up in one big package for you. What have you learned with all those experiences that would be really important to share with our international audience today about the intersection of guns and domestic violence?
Well, that's a great question. And it's a big question, right? The reality is this: we can't really speak to the needs of international communities without really knowing what's happening in those international communities, right? I'm really big as a community psychologist. I'm really focusing on understanding the experiences of communities and really embedding ourselves into those. So as a community psychologist and as a survivor, I bring a slightly different lens and framework than most folks when it comes to this work. I really work from a perspective of community and what it means to meaningfully engage community. And what I mean by that is like, what are the ways in which we are working with communities in order to inform and develop some of the solutions to the issues that they grapple with. I've learned that addressing the intersection of firearms and domestic violence, it's critical for the safety and well-being of survivors, and yet how that happens looks different for every community. So what we do here in the United States and what we do, what the efforts that are happening internationally are going to look very different because they're very unique and particular to the needs of those communities. What I've learned is that there's no one magic formula or a template that's going to solve the issue. But what I do know based from the work that I've done over the past 20 years is that addressing firearms and domestic violence requires a multi-layered and tailored approach. It requires a response that's intentional, that's inclusive, that's equitable, and that's tailored to the needs of each particular community. When we're thinking about how do we address this issue internationally and or domestically, I lean on the training and experience that I have as a community engagement practitioner. And the community engagement principles tell us that our service response must be inclusive of a few key components. And I'm going to go over a few components and some of the things that have already been shared by Kate and by Joe in terms of the challenges in communications between systems in looking at law enforcement service response, right? All of those things are really critical pieces into how we address firearms and domestic violence. And when we're talking about addressing this issue, one of the first things that I think about is that as we do this work and as we develop our response to firearms and domestic violence, that our response must be survivor and community centered. And it has to be informed by those disproportionately impacted by firearms and gun violence. Right. So what I've learned over the course of my career is that we can't develop strategies and protocols without the intentional inclusion and engagement of survivors and the communities that are most impacted. And what we're talking about communities, I'm talking about communities in a broad spectrum, right? So communities as the individuals who are involved in addressing this issue, communities as in the individuals who are most impacted by this issue. So what I'm referring to is ensuring that when we're centering communities in this work, not only are we looking at those responsible for ensuring and securing survivor safety, such as the criminal justice system and the judges and prosecutors, looking at probation departments, looking at child protection services, and all those different folks who play a key role in firearms and domestic violence, but also looking at centering community-based organizations, looking at working collaboratively with marginalized and underserved communities, and always ensuring that there's representation from all of those impacted. And that means making sure that we're partnering with racially and ethnically diverse communities, survivors, community-based organizations, making sure that we are partnering with the LGBTQI plus community, the elderly, individuals who with disabilities or who might be deaf or hard of hearing, and even looking at young adults, right? Because we're looking at young adults as well who, through the ages of 16 to 24, are also experiencing harm and ultimately death by the use of firearms in domestic violence situations and or dating violence situations. I've also learned in my work that if we're intentional about giving special attention to and creating firearms and domestic violence strategies and protocols that are grounded and centered on the realities of the most marginalized in our community, the most underserved, then when we create those strategies will work for all survivors. Something that's also really important is that whatever work we end up doing, right? Because what we know is there's really good work happening here in the United States to address domestic violence and firearms, and there's work happening internationally. But a lot of this work oftentimes is being conducted by individuals outside of our everyday communities, outside of those who are actually experiencing the domestic violence, outside of those who are having to deal with firearms and domestic violence on a daily basis. So a second component that I think is really critical to this work, and then what I recommend to both, folks domestically and internationally, is really making sure that whatever work we do and undertake is grounded in the realities of communities where these strategies and protocols are being implemented. So we really have to know the ins and outs of those communities that we're working with. We need to understand their varied histories. We need to understand the history of relationships between law enforcement and communities, the criminal justice system and communities, service providers and community, right? We make a lot of assumptions. We assume that these systems, services are created equally for everyone, that there's access to parity, and that everyone's experiences are similar. The reality is that they aren't, right? We really have to be able to look at what are the challenges that are impacting that community, and what are those community strengths? What are the things that folks have been doing for years within those communities to keep themselves safe? And how can we tap into that and lift up those strategies and be mindful and intentional and inclusive of those strategies into the work that we're doing? We have to explore what prevents survivors from seeking services, right? We know for a lot of racially and ethnically diverse communities, immigrant communities, marginalized and underserved, we're not all seeking services from the criminal justice response. Yes, it's wonderful that we have access to criminal justice response. It's wonderful that it's there for us, but there are also communities that are looking at alternatives to criminal justice response. And how do we marry that with the work that we're doing in efforts to prevent intimate partner homicide by firearm? We have to look at what accessing services for survivors has been like historically in those communities. We want to look at the demographics. What are the resources and services that are available? Oftentimes, community-based organizations are under-resourced. And we have to look at how the criminal justice system operates. Is it operating in a way that's beneficial to all community members? And what are those opportunities for enhancing that service response? We have to look at the capacity of law enforcement, right? We hear across the country that a lot of law enforcement agencies are short-staffed, right? So they don't have sufficient number of patrols on the ground to be able to respond to domestic violence calls, let alone to assess for lethality or to assess for firearms in the home and what steps need to happen after that. We hear that all the time. And we also have to look at those organizations who provide services to to domestic violence survivors. Do they have the necessary funding and resources to be able to respond in a way that is meaningful to members of their communities? So the reality is, in this work, both internationally and domestically, there isn't this cookie cutter approach that we can say, hey, there's this great model out there, let's implement it everywhere because it's going to work. The reality is that there are best practices out there that we can learn from, that we can glean information from, and then we can adapt to meet the needs of the communities that we're working with. Each community's realities are unique and therefore require an intentional and tailored service response. That means, again, that we have to be intentional about who we bring to the table, about who we partner with, about who we collaborate with. The inclusion of culturally specific community-based organizations, partners, and communities is critical. The fact that communities most impacted, it's important that those communities that are most impacted have access to services that are provided and led by their communities, whether it's a culturally specific community or a racially and ethnically diverse community. I can't stress enough the intentional engagement and the representation of self always lends to an inclusive and equitable response to firearms and domestic violence. And what I also can say is that this work does not happen and cannot happen in a vacuum. And it's depending on collaborative efforts and partnerships. I think Joe highlighted that very well. Really figuring out ways learning about how law enforcement works, right? Kay brought up the fact that, she had to deal with 2 different courts and those courts weren't talking to each other. So addressing the intersection of firearms and domestic violence requires a collaborative approach. It's important for all of us as local and national experts, law enforcement agencies, domestic violence service providers, policymakers, criminal justice folks, to really be intentional about working together to develop comprehensive strategies that really center that particular community's needs and prioritize survivor safety and well-being. We know here that in the United States, there are federal firearms prohibitors that are in place to provide guidance on what actions and what steps we need to take as communities and as practitioners. And yet how that guidance is implemented is where we can have the most significant impact, right? So these prohibitors wouldn't necessarily apply to the international community per se, but they do lend themselves to the development of a process of how we can, on how we get to addressing firearms that could be promising practice for those here in the U.S. and for those outside of the U.S.
Marie?
Yes.
Marie?
Yeah.
I need to interject to move to our next panelist. We do have a couple questions for you in the chat, but I just wanted to let you know that we'll get back to in a few minutes, but I didn't want to run out of time for our next panelist.
Perfect. Well, thank you. I appreciate you stopping me because I can go on for days.
I know we all could about this topic, couldn't we? Yes. So Ruth, my next question is for you, and I'm counting on you to bring us full circle, because like Kate, you are a woman who has survived being shot by her estranged husband. Like Joe, you've held a position of state level leadership in addressing domestic violence. And now you have led and are leading national organizations. And on top of all this, you also advocate for legislative change in addressing domestic violence and firearms. So what I'd like to ask you is, how does legislative change in the area of guns and domestic violence play a role in survivor safety? and play a role in offender accountability across the country?
So first I would like to say, Lou Marie, Kate, Joe, fantastic. Thank you so much. And particularly the whole idea of addressing the issue from community place. If we don't have, and I hate to use this overtired term, but we use it a lot in the United States, a coordinated community response that includes survivors and that includes all of those impacted, because you're definitely going to have a different type of community in one area of the state versus another area of the state. So if you don't have some of that working for you, legislation is going to be difficult to develop, difficult to implement. But I would also say that shouldn't prevent us from moving forward on legislation that will help us be responsive and set some kind of standard of what we will accept as a nation and what we won't. So from a congressional perspective, I too was at the Capitol, wasn't the Capitol this week, it was the Supreme Court. I too was at the Supreme Court and giving witness to the Rahimi case and saying that this particular case, when you look at 40 years of history, and from a legislative perspective, a bipartisan perspective of why this was, the Lautenberg and all of those elements were put in place over 40 years ago, were to protect survivors from firearms, because we recognized 40 years ago how dangerous it was for perpetrators and those who had access to firearms when there was domestic violence present. They wanted to do something about it. So why would we peel back those protections, right? And in fact, I would challenge us to think, which everyone on this call knows, is that if you have a protection order, and by the way, we're not going to protect you from the firearm, I don't understand how that then is a protection order, correct? And particularly if the victim and survivor has taken everything that they know how to go forward and get a protection order. It's very, very difficult to ask for a protection order. And in fact, some of our audience members have even said, well, how do we make sure that survivors feel comfortable from where they come from as a community? Well, that's the community response. That's helping communities understand, and particularly survivors, that they can come forward, or that we will help them come forward. It doesn't do any good to come forward if we don't have legislation that can meet that need. So what we've done is we have, well, there's a couple of things I'd like to speak to really quickly. One is that we have developed really critical responses to Rahimi, for instance. So anytime that there are these issues that are either rolling back protections, particularly as they relate to domestic violence and firearms, it is our intent, like you all, to be front and center and say, you cannot do that. And here's why. 40 years ago, we developed legislation that was a protective factor, and now you're trying to remove that, when in fact, to Joel's point, we need more protection. So not only are we not going to allow you to peel back that protection, we're going to put other protections in place, because we can't stop there, right? And then at local levels, what I would encourage is that we remind those systems that Joe talked about, and even our state legislatures, about the criticalness of addressing domestic violence and firearms. One of the things I'm noting, and I would welcome any of my panelists to remark as well, is that at state legislatures, they seem to be focused on ERPOs and red flags and those types of remedies to deal with firearms and domestic violence. I would encourage anyone listening to talk to their state legislature about how that's perfectly fine. ERPOs are perfectly fine, but not in the context of domestic violence. That they need to be addressing the issue of firearms and domestic violence. And we need to start with first responders. By that, I mean law enforcement, even EMT and those folks to say, we've got to do something a little bit different when it comes to domestic violence. And then we can look at the progression of law and responsibility and that type of thing for first responders and everyone to respond appropriately to domestic violence and firearms. It's just a little concerning watching the state legislators. And it's not because they're not trying to do the right thing. I want to be very clear about that. It's because they just don't know that nuance that we've all spoken to here on this call. I think the other thing is, Lautenberg and all of those folks who worked 40 years ago, even through the Violence Against Women Act, we can do more. And it is important because localities need to have a framework to work from, right? What I hear from most from localities is you all, from a federal perspective and a national perspective, tell us we must, then you don't figure out ways to support that. And I would challenge that. And I would say through your STOP grants, through other mechanisms, we can make sure that those first responders are appropriately trained, that they have the appropriate resources, such as BWJP's technical assistance, to help them address what their needs are as a community. I think that we might also look toward, and then I'll turn it over to questions, but I think we also might look toward the new gun violence prevention entity within the federal government. It's a result of the Better Communities Safety Act. I hope I got that right. BCSA. Yes, all the acronyms, right? But there needs to be an element, and we need to push for an element of domestic violence response in that entity, so that we get the appropriate response from everyone, and that includes Congress. The second thing I want to say is that will be Survivor Justice Action's top priority, is talking about how we can hold policymakers accountable for not addressing this issue. And because not only do we lose lives, that firearm being used by someone in the home who wants to cause harm and needs to keep that power and control, it's such a mechanism of control. I will say it and say it again. It's not always a tool of lethality and fatality, but it is definitely a tool of control. So when someone comes forward and says, I need a protection order, it's because they know that's been used, or they've been subject to that firearm being used as a mechanism of control. And now they know the dangerousness is at a point where they need help. I hope that answered the question. I could go on.
Great.
And I think, you made a great point, Ruth. I think a lot about this work is about education, right? It's education and accountability. It's being able to educate service responders at every point of the domestic violence service response. And it's also the ability of being able to hold them accountable. When we collaborate with folks in these projects and they make commitment to enhancing the domestic violence service response in regards to firearms, we all come to this work with good intentions. And we all bring our ideas of what we feel might work best. And I can't remember who said it earlier about working collaboratively. Sometimes we have to leave our ideas and preconceived notions about what we want to see happen outside the door, our meeting room where we're meeting in, and be open to what's going to organically transpire within the conversation, always knowing that education is a huge part of how this work happens. We have to educate judges. We have to educate law enforcement officers. We have to educate advocates, right? To know what questions to ask, to know what are the strategies that are available for survivors in these situations. And we have to be able and willing to hold each other and others accountable so that this work actually happens in ways that, again, are meaningful and that meet our end goal of increasing survivor safety and saving lives.
Thank you.
Do we have any questions from our listeners?
Yeah, we have quite a few, and we have a short amount of time. So I think to summarize, there are a lot of questions about the response and how to motivate that change within systems. So as a last comment, what do you think will make this change to the response happen, be it whether it's law enforcement or outside of law enforcement and communities?
I would love to respond to that really quickly, because I think that when we're talking about systems, policymakers, the bottom line is, what is it costing you and your community to not address this? And I don't mean just dollars, right? I mean everything. What is the cost when we have fatalities related to death? And the victim was a domestic violence victim, and the perpetrator was a domestic abuser. And if we're not appropriately holding him accountable, what is it costing our system when he goes and does it again? If we are dealing with a death, we never have to, but we do. If we're dealing with a death, what's the impact on the society, the community around them? How many of their children might have to will need counseling? What did it cost us to respond to that scene? The list goes on and on and on of what the impact on the community would be if you don't address it up front. Now, you're not going to prevent every instance. We know that. But what can you do to minimize what the impact of the community will be? Do you want to be responsible for children who have post-traumatic stress disorder and are not able to function appropriately in their public schools? Do you want the cost it was to keep a victim on a respirator for 3 days before she passes away? The list goes on, and I know I'm sounding really dramatic, but we have to put it in the terms they understand, which is cost. It's going to be millions of dollars. It's going to be a long-term impact on your community. How many workplace incidents are as a result of domestic violence? The person went into the workplace and he killed his partner, and oh, by the way, two of her coworkers or his coworkers, whichever it might be. What is that cost? What is that cost to that community? And bigger than that. So whenever someone asks that question, that is my response. And I'm sure others on the call have a response, but remember to put it in, particularly with policymakers, put it in context of real cost and financial cost.
And I would add to that, let's not forget the faces, right? The Ruth, Glens, and the Kates of the world. These are real lives that are being lost, right? Every single day. Yes, the costs are going to motivate some folks, but sometimes we might have to tug at the heartstrings of folks and just say, if this were in your family, if this were your daughter, your wife, what would you like to see happen? The truth is that it's happening way too much, way too often. And we're trying to do the best that we can. We're trying to do the best that we can, and we'll continue to fight this fight, right? As advocates, we don't give up. I saw some questions about the ruling of Rahimi. Regardless of what happens, we are going to continue the fight, and we're going to continue finding ways to figure out how we keep survivors safe, particularly in situations of firearms and domestic violence. We're not giving up. We're not giving up. So count on that.
I always call it the ripple effect of domestic violence. I think that we tend to forget about as a society. Like, I was the target and he came after me. However, my father happened to be there in the apartment at the time and he was shot too. And my son was also there and he witnessed it. And he's 15 now. And as Ruth witnessed the other day on the steps of the Supreme Court, he's doing amazing. But I mean, I come from a very strong family and I had a really good, solid, support system in place. But I mean, the ripple effect is, I mean, there were people calling 911 from the scene because it was an apartment complex. So those people were also affected. We had an eyewitness that saw the entire thing from her balcony. She's affected. She had to come testify at trial. And I think that it's just very underestimated the absolute ripple effect of domestic violence. It's not behind closed doors and it's not just between the intimate partners.
I just have a really quick thing. I ran into a woman 10 years ago because my incident happened 30 years ago. My then husband had to have this, it was this whole SWAT situation. So there's millions of dollars or thousands of dollars there. But I will tell you, this woman saw me and she said, I know whom you are. I will never forget. And I will never forget the trauma. She used that word of needing to spend 3 hours locked in my home because of what that person did. So these are real things. These are real things. And I love what Kate and Marie both said about the personal touch. If the cost doesn't get them, you talk about the personal touch. Yeah, sorry. I just needed to say that. You can tell how passionate we are.
Pat, do we have any other questions? You're on mute, Pat.
Sorry about that. Yes, we've had a lot. And there was one way early on that I also thought was interesting, which was about legal and illegal guns and the difference. And I know that we have a minute, so I don't know if someone could define that quickly.
I mean, I think it's going into a gun dealer and legally purchasing a gun versus a private sale or going to a gun show where you don't have to have any sort of background checks. That's my quick understanding in a nutshell. Background check versus no background check.
Yeah.
It could also mean someone that, because Joe gave very good statistics on people that actually had a gun, used it to shoot someone, but were prohibited from having a gun. So that's another way you might define illegal guns, is that person is not allowed to have one, but had one anyway. And last but not least, in most states, there are prohibitions against the kind of, even if you are legally allowed to have a gun, the kind of gun you can buy. For example, you can't, in some states, buy a machine gun. That would be, so there are, when we say illegal gun, that sometimes means different things. It can mean what Kate just said. It can mean someone that's prohibited from having a gun, or someone that could have a gun, but bought a gun that nobody is supposed to have. Well, Pat, should we answer any more questions? Do we need to be cutting off at our time?
We've come to our time.
Well, then, for anyone that has a burning question that they really would have liked to have had answered, please let us know in the chat if we can contact you later about if you had a resource that you were wondering about, for example. Sophia will also be putting in the chat resources connected to each of our panelists today, so you can see where they work and what they've written. And so at this point, then I'd like to thank our guests for talking to us today, thanking our listeners for listening in. I'd also like to thank my colleagues, Patricia Cumby and Sophia Morissette, for ensuring that this all went smoothly on the tech side. And so we have included links in the chat to learn more. If you'd like to support global rights for women, your contribution goes to supporting the work of advocates, centering survivor voices, and achieving systemic change. You will get, as we said earlier, an email in the next few days with resources, as well as a link to the recording. And once again, thank you all so very much for being here. It was an honor to share this space with you all.
Thank you all.
Goodbye.
Thank you all. It was